Over time, conspiracy theorists have promoted and shared various photographs and information which they claim are undeniable proof of a worldwide mud flood and of the former existence of what they call the Tartarian Empire. Again and again, these images are included in a plethora of YouTube videos, as if they are gospel. Yet the proponents of these conspiracy theory videos have never actually bothered to look into what these photos are actually of. This video will examine some of the more well-known pieces of supposed mud flood and Tartarian evidence and reveal their true origin and history. We begin with this photo. The interest this photograph has to mud flood and Tartarian believers is obvious. They see the rubble and the seemingly underground structures in the foreground and come to the rapid conclusion that this represents the existence of a previous unknown civilization which the current inhabitants have simply built on top of. The reality is far more mundane. The photo was taken in the mid-1970s in the city of Seattle and shows a section along First Avenue and the corner of University Street. The photo was taken from a position on Seneca Street looking northwest. The brown building in the centre of the photo is the former Dilla Hotel, built in 1890. Here it is in its heyday. And here it is today, used mainly as apartments. But what about the rubble and subterranean brick structures? This gap in the landscape was once filled by 3 hotels. The Arlington Hotel, later known as the Bay Building, the Hotel Victoria, and the Hotel Seneca. This map from 1908 clearly shows these 3 hotels. In this article from the Seattle Daily Times dated the 24th of October 1974, it says that the permit to demolish the Bay Building had been given, while just a week later, this article from the same newspaper states that wrecking of the Bay Building and others already has begun in the block between University Street and Seneca Street. This photo shows a portion of the Bay Building still standing, hours before it was finally demolished. Here you can see the Bay Building in July 1974, all boarded up and ready for demolition. And in this photo taken in November 1974, taken from the same place, you can see that the hotel has now been completely destroyed. As these hotels were built on sloping ground, their foundations were of course deeper on the higher area of ground immediately abutting First Avenue. This photo taken in 1975 shows the extent of the demolition. The window-like structures visible in the brickwork are simply the remains of the deep basements and access to smaller storage areas of the hotels. This is how the site remained for nearly 20 years and was a local eyesore before the commencement of the harbour steps and post-alley redevelopment construction which got underway in the early 1990s. This is the harbour steps development today. Note that the Dilla Hotel is just visible in the background. It is abundantly clear from the photographic and map evidence that the 1970s photo does not depict evidence of a mud flood or a previous civilization. Instead, the evidence shows the changing urban landscape of one small area of Seattle. Just like the previously examined photo from Seattle, this photograph taken in Paris is one of the most often featured in mud flood conspiracy videos and is almost universally taken by mud flooders as being definitive proof, not only that the mud flood occurred, but that present-day buildings actually extend much further underground. In actuality, the photo shows the excavation for the Les Halles shopping centre, which opened in 1979. In addition to the construction of the shopping centre and other amenities, the excavation was also designed to include 2 subway train lines which would meet under the new complex, hence the very deep nature of the excavation. The area was originally the site of a medieval market, and in the 19th century it was the premier market for food in Paris. In 1971, however, it was demolished to make way for the current shopping centre. Due to the depth of the digging, the buildings and roads above had to be protected from collapsing into the pit, a very real threat. Therefore, the engineers were required to strengthen the subsoil with vast amounts of concrete. This is clearly visible in the photograph. However, mudflood Tartarian believers choose to see these concrete supports as extensions of the buildings above. That is, that the buildings above extend all the way to the bottom of the excavation. This is a peculiar conclusion to reach, especially considering that the buildings above the excavation do not line up with the supporting concrete far below. It is clear that the buildings are set well back from the edge of the pit, and therefore the concrete supports way below are not part of the buildings above. Or to put it another way, the buildings above do not extend deep underground as mudflood Tartarian proponents continually claim. In many mudflood conspiracy videos, the creator of the video will claim that modern architecture and engineering is totally incapable of building neoclassical buildings in this day and age. Neoclassical buildings are often thought of as being of Tartarian origin. As they are so often heard stating, "We can't build buildings like these anymore. We've lost the technology. We can't do it." Actually, these types of buildings are still being constructed today. It is called New Classical Architecture and is the successor to Neoclassical. A few prominent examples of New Classical Architecture include the Schermerhorn Symphony Center in Nashville, Tennessee, built in 2006. And here is the interior of it. The Maitland Robinson Library, built in 1992, part of Cambridge University in England. Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity Chapel, built in 2009 on the grounds of the Thomas Aquinas College in Ventura County, California. And virtually the entire town of Poundbury in Dorset, England. This is yet another example of mudflood Tartarian believers simply making things up. Clearly, we are still very capable of building in the neoclassical and new classical style. In 2004, a declassified CIA document, one amongst many thousands, was released to the general public. These documents cover a wide range of topics, yet this one in particular eventually caught the attention of those who believe in the mudflood Tartarian conspiracy theory. The document exposes the hypocrisy of the early Soviet regime, specifically their commitment to the cultural and national identities of the many non-Russian peoples who now found themselves under Soviet rule. The Soviets promised all manner of freedoms to all the peoples within the former Imperial Russia, yet before long the Soviets began to introduce laws and measures to suppress those very same cultural identities and ways of life. The document identifies the Soviets saying one thing and then acting in a completely opposite way. And it's not just the peoples of the Tartarian regions that are mentioned. It also includes the Kyrgyz, the Turks and the Chechens, amongst others. The attitude of the Soviets was to justify their rule and show them in a positive light to the far distant peoples of Soviet Central Asia, Siberia, and places further east. And to do this, they had to edit sections of Russian history in terms of the Russians' previous and often aggressive dealings with these various communities. In the short term, this was done to help legitimize the new Soviet power structure as it moved ever more eastwards, and in the long term to fully consolidate Soviet power and eventually take full control of these often far-flung regions. However, because it is a declassified CIA document, and because it happens to mention Tartarian peoples, the conspiracy theorists choose to pretend that it is solid evidence that the Soviets are trying to hide the existence of the Tartarian Empire. A link to the document is below, and you are invited to read it for yourself. And in doing so, you will quickly see that this analysis of changing Soviet attitudes to their eastern non-Russian communities has literally nothing whatsoever to do with the mythical Tartarian Empire. And on the subject of Russia, these photos are of the Vrubel Museum in Omsk, and perhaps more than any other mudflood photos are the most widely used as evidence of the supposed mudflood. Today, the building is known as the Vrubel Museum of Fine Arts and was designed by architect Andrei Kryachov, a well-known architect and engineer who was educated in St. Petersburg. Originally, it was a trade corpus building, which means it was a collection of various merchants, retail establishments, a bank and restaurants, and was completed in 1914. The building contained 3 floors. The commercial floors occupied the top 2 levels, while the third lower floor was for staff and trades entrance, storage of goods, foods and inventory, changing rooms for the staff, and so on. Soon after completion, however, the building changed its use and was then occupied by various political groups and organisations. As such, the lowest floor, which was designed to receive goods and produce for the shops and restaurants above, was simply no longer needed as an entry point, and so the land around it was filled in. It was also at this time when other buildings were being constructed in the area and the land was being raised to meet the needs of increased traffic. After the tumultuous events of the Russian Revolution, which saw the establishment of the Soviet Union, the building in 1924 was converted into an art gallery, and that remains its function to this day. A few years ago, deep excavations were required to be made to take care of much-needed foundational repairs, and these photos were taken during that work. Once completed, the lowest floor was once again buried. However, conspiracy theorists look at these excavation photos and immediately jump to the erroneous conclusion that the photos are proof that the building was buried by the global mud flood. If the evil elites had been so determined to cover up the mud flood event in the first place, why would they now allow a mud-flooded building to be fully excavated down to its foundations in broad daylight and reveal the buried lower floor for all the world to see? In addition, the Vrubel Art Gallery is built on higher ground, above other neoclassical buildings in the area, and none of these other buildings exhibit mud flood elements. So how could this be? Why would a building on higher ground be the victim of the mud flood, but the equally grand and ornate buildings on the lower ground not show signs of being buried? The answer, of course, is that there is no such thing as the mud flood. It is apparent that mud flood believers are happy to just accept photos they find on the internet without doing any research, if those photos happen to fit their mud flood fantasies. And the reason why mud flooders refuse to do research is for three main reasons. 1. They believe that all of history is fake, and therefore old documents and records simply cannot be trusted, so there's no point in looking at them anyway. 2. They can't be bothered. And 3. They know that actual research will, of course, refute their fantasies. It is therefore ironic that mud flooders are always commanding everyone else to do your research. And saying that history is fake isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. It doesn't absolve one of the need to undertake research. The hole in the ground in Seattle, the shopping centre in Paris, the art gallery in Omsk, all of these photos are again and again held up as evidence of the mud flood. Yet this video has clearly shown that all of them have much more mundane, real-world origins.